Today, we're diving into one of the most brutal and important battles in all of human history, the Battle of Stalingrad. This wasn't just any battle. It was a conflict so huge, so devastating, that it literally changed the entire course of World War II. So that's the big question, right? How on earth did a fight for one single city on the Volga River manage to shift the momentum of the entire war? Well, that's exactly what we're going to break down. Okay, so to really get this, we have to start at the beginning. Why was this city so incredibly important? What was it about Stalingrad that made both sides willing to throw everything they had at it?
Well, Stalingrad was a total strategic jackpot. For starters, it sat on the Volga River, making it a vital hub for transporting oil and grain throughout the Soviet Union. It was also a massive industrial center, cranking out weapons and supplies for the war. But there was something else, something personal. The city was named after the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. For Germany's leader, Adolf Hitler, taking it wasn't just strategic, it was a massive propaganda win. So for both leaders, this was a prize they absolutely had to have.
Now, the Germans rolled in expecting a pretty quick and easy victory. What they got instead was a brand new kind of hell. A war fought not on open fields, but in the rubble of a city that had been completely annihilated. The battle kicked off with a huge bombing campaign by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. They basically flattened the entire city. But here's the crazy part. It completely backfired. Instead of clearing a path for their troops, all that bombing created the perfect defensive landscape for the Soviets. A maze of ruins, rubble, and destroyed buildings to hide in. The German soldiers even had a name for this kind of fighting, Rattenkrieg, which literally means rat war. And honestly, it's the perfect description for what was happening. We're talking brutal, face-to-face combat for every single basement, every factory floor, and even down in the city's sewer systems. And this chart really shows you just how different things were. In normal warfare, you have tanks and planes dominating open fields. Here, every single room was its own battlefield. Progress wasn't measured in miles, but in yards, sometimes even feet. And ambushes could come from any direction, from any pile of rubble. So, while the Germans were getting bogged down, bleeding for every single city block, the Soviets were secretly cooking up something massive, a plan designed to flip the entire battle on its head. The plan was called Operation Uranus, and it was brilliant. The Soviets secretly gathered over 1 million soldiers, but they didn't attack the strong German forces head-on in the city. No, they hit the weaker armies that were protecting the German flanks. They smashed right through those lines with thousands of tanks, and in just 4 days, poof, they had trapped the entire German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad. The result was a complete catastrophe for the Germans. 250,000 of their soldiers were suddenly cut off with no way out. The attackers had just become the trapped, and their situation was about to get a whole lot worse. Being surrounded was bad enough, but then an even older, more powerful enemy showed up on the battlefield, the brutal Russian winter. The head of the German Luftwaffe made a huge promise to Hitler. He said he could supply the entire trapped army by air. This air bridge was supposed to fly in everything they needed to survive and keep fighting. But it was a promise he just couldn't keep. The airlift was a total disaster. You can see it right here. The army was promised 300 tons of supplies every single day. In reality, they got less than 50. Between the Soviet Air Force shooting them down and the terrible weather, the mission was impossible. The trapped soldiers began to starve. And on top of the starvation came the cold. We're talking about temperatures that plunged to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a level of cold that can kill a person in minutes if they're not protected. The German army was just not equipped for this. Their soldiers didn't have the right winter coats or gloves or boots. They were suffering from horrible frostbite, freezing to death right in their trenches. The winter itself became an enemy just as deadly as the Soviet soldiers. So now you have an army that's starving, freezing, and running out of ammunition. The Sixth Army was completely falling apart. The end of the battle was coming, one way or another. The German commander, General Paulus, radioed Hitler, asking for permission to surrender to save what was left of his men. Hitler's response was cold and clear: fight to the last man. He even promoted Paulus to field marshal on the spot, a symbolic move, since no German field marshal had ever been taken alive. The message was clear. Paulus was expected to take his own life, but Paulus defied that order. On January 31st, 1943, he surrendered. 2 days later, the last remaining German forces gave up.
After more than 5 months of some of the most brutal fighting imaginable, the Battle of Stalingrad was finally over.
About 90,000 German soldiers, the ones who had somehow survived the fighting, the cold, and the starvation, were marched into captivity as prisoners of war. But their nightmare was far from over. Of those 90,000 men who were captured, only about 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The vast majority died in the incredibly harsh conditions of Soviet prison camps in the years that followed.
So the battle was over, but its impact was just beginning to ripple across the world. So let's get back to our big question. Why do we call this the great turning point of World War II? First, the human cost is almost impossible to comprehend. When you add up all the military and civilian losses on both sides, the total casualties are estimated to be around 2 million people. That makes it one of the single bloodiest battles in the history of warfare.
But beyond the numbers, Stalingrad was the moment the German war machine was stopped in its tracks. Their advance into the east was halted for good. From this point on, Germany was on the defensive, getting pushed all the way back to Berlin. The victory gave a massive morale boost to all the Allies and turned the city of Stalingrad into a powerful global symbol of resistance. The tide of the war had well and truly turned.
You know, the sheer scale of the fighting, the destruction, and the human suffering at Stalingrad is almost impossible for us to fully wrap our heads around. And it leaves us with a final, really important question to think about. What does this story really teach us about the true cost of war?